Hey there, sleep-deprived history enthusiasts tuning in tonight. Forget knights, nobles, or even honest servants with decent sleeping quarters. You're the court jester now. That ridiculous clown prancing about in silk-lined chambers full of concealed daggers. Those bells sewn to your costume? They're not decoration. They're your leash, announcing every move so no one forgets what you truly are. You mock their enemies, their priests, sometimes even your masters when feeling particularly bold. But always carefully, always briefly. Because in this twisted world, the line between amusement and offense is as thin as a forced smile, and grows dangerously thinner when the wine runs dry. Before they drag you into the firelight to perform your humiliating dance, do me one small favor. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm endlessly fascinated by our global audience. Want early access to more of these grim historical tales? Ad-free audio episodes? Or just wish to support the show? Check the Patreon link below. Now settle in. Get comfortable. Let's begin this tragicomedy. No one remembers the exact moment they labeled you different, but someone does. Maybe it was your untimely crying fits, or that disturbing habit of laughing at all the wrong moments. Perhaps your awkward limbs, that cracking voice arriving too early and too loud. Could have been your twisted spine, your lazy eye, or maybe just that unsettlingly knowing look in a child's face. Whatever the reason, the adults started watching you differently, some with pity, others with fear. The worst ones, they watched with interest. You grew up in some forgotten backwater village, the kind that only appears on maps when someone gets murdered or married. Your so-called family worked the land poorly and drank away their meager earnings. You slept near the hearth in the same scratchy sack you were born in, learning to hold your breath when rainwater dripped through the ceiling. Dreams weren't discussed here. You didn't dream of escape. You barely dreamed at all. Early on, you noticed people laughed when you spoke. Not at your words, but at the fact you spoke them. You asked questions other children didn't. Why the priest reeked of wine? Why the reeve hoarded pigs while you starved? Why God only afflicted the poor with boils? Sometimes the laughter came quick and nervous, other times slow and cruel, but it always came. At first you mistook it for affection. You'd learn better. The village idiot drooled in the tavern corner. You thought yourself different until catching your reflection in a water basin. That same unsettling gleam in the eyes. That look of someone who sees too much and gets punished for it. Yet you kept talking because silence felt like death. You composed songs, mimicked the priest's lisp, crossed your eyes while blessing chickens. The villagers called you clever in the same tone they used for cursed things. Then came the man in the dark green cloak, riding a horse with shoes finer than anything you owned, smelling of neither dung nor smoke. The villagers straightened when he entered the tavern, not nobility, but close enough to command fear. Some steward or envoy with a title no one understood. You didn't notice him watching from the shadows as you performed your drunken Miller routine behind the tavern, arms flailing, cheeks puffed, wheezing like a broken bellows. The next day, whichever woman claimed responsibility for you sat you down with all the warmth of someone delivering bad news. "You're leaving," she said, handing you a linen bundle before walking away mid-question. Inside, a goat-stinking shirt, petrified bread, and a wooden cup carved with someone else's initials. The steward never addressed you directly, only discussing you with the carter like livestock. This one might be useful. Not talented, not promising, just useful. You rode between crates of squawking poultry, fighting nausea from the stench. Questions died in your throat under the driver's glare. Eventually, you learned to cage your thoughts behind clenched teeth. The journey blurred into days or weeks. You lost count after the third freezing night and the second will theft attempt in some nameless village. You slept on grain sacks, chewing slowly to avoid accusations of gluttony. The driver alternated between mocking you and forgetting you existed. The chickens received more consistent care. The cart creaked through the outer gates at dusk, painting the muddy courtyard in smudged grays and that peculiar silence of being watched. The castle wasn't the grand fortress from minstrels' tales, but a damp stone monstrosity half strangled by ivy. its crooked chimneys belching uneven smoke trails across a yard scratched by chickens. The air stank of wood smoke, wet straw, and something vaguely meaty left rotting too long. No fanfare greeted your arrival. The steward barely slowed. A guard gave the cart the same attention he'd give a turnip wagon. Not precious cargo, not even curious. Just some oversized tunic boy clinging to a linen bundle, trying not to fall into the mud as the cart jolted through shouting servants. It stopped by the stables. "Get off," the driver said. No ceremony, no introductions. The steward finally looked at you when returning your bundle. "Follow," he commanded, already turning toward a side door. You stumbled after him past dung-slick troughs and a kitchen window vomiting steam alongside someone screaming about leaks. Everything felt oversized, walls too tall, doors too small, windows where faces appeared and vanished when met with eye contact. The steward led you around the keep's rear, through a low arch into a hallway reeking of boiled onions, scorched fat, and ancient wet wool. Soot-streaked walls bore traces of something stickier as servants bustled past with the permanent exhaustion of the overworked. One shoulder checked you without apology, another did a double take and muttered, "Is that it?" before disappearing. You didn't ask what it meant. Up a narrow, condensation-slick staircase you went, too breathless for questions. A deep-set window offered your first elevated view of the intestinal castle layout, smaller than imagined, built not for glory, but for trapping warmth and people. Finally, the steward stopped at an iron-bound door, knocked once, and entered without waiting. The storage room, or perhaps it was the steward's office, swallowed you in its musty darkness. Cramped shelves sagged under the weight of neglected ledgers and coarse fabric bolts, the air thick with dust and the sour tang of old parchment. A man glanced up from his slate-covered desk, already waving dismissal before registering your presence. His hand froze mid-gesture as his eyes narrowed into the calculating stare of a farmer assessing sick livestock. "Is this the one?" he asked, voice rough as unpolished stone. The steward shrugged. "He'll do." The seated man motioned vaguely, perhaps meaning stand still, perhaps breathe quieter, before eyeing your pathetic bundle. "That all you brought?" You nodded. No one asked your name. No one offered theirs. Just the rustle of parchment as he scribbled something illegible, handing it to the steward with finality. "He's yours now," the man declared. "Until he isn't. No welcome. No contract. Just the transfer of responsibility, like handing off a sack of moldy potatoes." The steward tucked the parchment into his coat and jerked his chin toward the door. "Come on," he muttered. "You'll eat after the others." Too stunned to protest, you followed. The corridor swallowed you in wool cloaks and murmured exhaustion. Every doorway framed steaming pots or dripping meats or shouted arguments. The castle pulsed with a low, constant tension, like a sleeping beast twitching in dreams. You struggled to match the steward's stride, slipping on damp rushes until your foot squelched into something unspeakable. He didn't pause to see if you'd fallen. Eventually, the kitchen's roar hit like a physical blow, clanging pots, hissing grease, an off-key voice chopping vegetables with alarming violence. The steward slopped grayish gruel into a wooden bowl and thrust it at you. "Eat. Don't take long." You perched on an overturned bucket near the hearth, balancing the bowl in your lap. Porridge? Pea mash? The contents hardly mattered. It was warm. You shoveled it down under the sideways glances of servants who clearly hadn't been warned about your arrival. No one sat beside you. Someone coughed pointedly. You kept your eyes lowered. When the miserable meal ended, another silent command sent you trailing the steward past laundry vats and meat hooks, past a door reeking of pickled fish. As you turned a corner, you nearly collided with a man who stepped aside without comment, but his presence froze the steward mid-step. Tall and heavy-set, the stranger's ring-laden fingers glittered like captured stars under torchlight. His velvet robes, a deep, untarnished green, stood out against the castle's general grime. He studied you like an ugly trinket left carelessly on display, then flicked his fingers in a gesture so slight it could have meant anything. The steward nodded. No words exchanged. Just that flick, and the world moved obediently around him. Finally, you reached your new quarters, a lumpy mattress crammed into a stairwell alcove, half covered by a moth-eaten blanket with a dented tin cup as your sole furnishing. A candle stub wept wax onto the stones above. The steward pointed. Here, don't wander. Don't touch anything. Then, ominously, when you hear bells, move. You nodded, though the warning made no sense. He left without another word. You set your bundle down, testing the straw mattress that sagged like a dead animal. Distant footsteps and creaking doors drifted through the stones. Occasionally laughter sliced through, sharp, sudden, followed by loaded silence. You wondered who laughed. You wondered who was being laughed at. This wasn't a room, not even a cell. Just leftover space, too awkward for storage, too exposed for privacy. Not inside, not outside. You'd been placed like an afterthought. The blanket smelled faintly of smoke and something sour. You pulled it over your legs and lay back, staring at stone barely a hand's breadth from your face. Shadows flickered in the hallway. A passing servant, a guttering rushlight. The castle never truly slept, it merely slowed. You clutched your bundle to your chest, suddenly aware of how far you were from anything familiar. Your limbs ached. Your eyes burned. No one had told you what tomorrow held. No one had told you anything at all. They hadn't dressed you in motley yet, hadn't demanded performances. But from the moment those gates closed behind you, you'd felt the roll settle onto your shoulders like a second skin. You didn't know the joke yet. You only knew it had already begun. The next evening, your uniform arrived without ceremony. Just a lumpy wool bundle dumped outside the wardrobe room like spoiled laundry. The colors assaulted the eyes, patches of red, green, and yellow stitched together with what appeared to be active malice. The fabric reeked of mildew, vinegar, and generations of anxious sweat. It took you too long to realize this was your skin now. The outfit sagged with the memory of other bodies, heavier, or perhaps just worn longer. You wondered how many fools had donned this costume before you. How many had stopped being fools before they stopped breathing? The bells were the cruelest touch, tiny brass horrors sewn into every hem. Not cheerful, not festive, a leash that jingled. They announced your every movement, betrayed every attempt at stealth, reminded you nightly that silence was no longer yours to claim. You experimentally shook your sleeve. The sound was soft but endless, like a whispered warning. The hat completed the humiliation, a drooping three-pointed monstrosity the color of a sun-scabbed wound. When you picked it up, a folded parchment scrap fluttered out, stained with what might have been blood and bearing the imprint of a thumbnail pressed too hard into the crease. You stared at it too long before tossing it into the hearth. Whatever message it carried wasn't yours to inherit. They gave you no privacy to change. Just orders to don the costume and return when your bells could be heard down the corridor. You dressed behind a linen rack, fingers trembling on age-stiffened laces. The tunic pinched your armpits while gaping at the waist. The leggings clung together through sheer stubbornness. When fully assembled, the motley felt less like clothing and more like a second skin you couldn't shed. Then came the stick, not a staff or baton, just 2 feet of ashwood tipped with a pig's bladder stitched fat like some grotesque tumor. It squeaked when squeezed, smacked with a wet thwop. Your tool, the handler said. Your symbol, your companion. When you dared ask its purpose, he shrugged. Hit people, or get hit, or wave it around like an idiot. Whatever works. The first time you crossed the flagstones in full costume, the bells felt like 1,000 judging eyes. However carefully you stepped, the jingling betrayed you. Every shift of your shoulders, every hesitant footfall. Servants smirked. Others looked away as if eye contact might be contagious. You tried standing straighter, but the ill-fitting wool twisted across your chest while the hat's drooping horn slid over one eye. Your reflection in a polished kitchen tray stopped you cold. The colors screamed. The proportions lied. Your forced grin made your teeth look crooked. You stared at this garish stranger, watching the distorted figure shimmer in the convex metal, your limbs elongated, eyes bulging, body simultaneously exaggerated and diminished. A caricature, a walking joke, a shadow in paint and bells. You attempted a smile, but the reflection's expression didn't change. The corners of your mouth twitched while your eyes remained dead. There was something deeply wrong about watching yourself pretend to be someone you'd never chosen to become. Leaning closer until your nose nearly touched the metal, you didn't notice the scullery maid walking past without acknowledgement. You couldn't blame her. The first performance command came without warning. One moment you're hunched on your cot puzzling over sleep without jingling. The next a kitchen boy's head pokes into your alcove announcing, "You're wanted in the hall." Now, no explanations. You just grabbed your bladder stick like a lifeline and followed the torchlight through corridors that seemed narrower in the dark. Every step sent bells chiming ahead like heralds of your humiliation. You had no script, no instructions, only the crushing certainty that whatever happened next needed to be funny. The hall doors stood already open, firelight spilling across rushes thick with the greasy stench of recently devoured meat. You entered slowly, blinking against the brightness after dark passages. Nobles lounged at long tables, licking gravy from their fingers and wine from their teeth. A few glanced up. One nudged his neighbor. Someone groaned, "Not him again," but the words drowned in general noise. The ring-handed lord slouched at the high table, swirling something blood-dark in his cup. His lazy finger wave wasn't invitation, it was command. You took position by the fire pit where flickering light carved grotesque shadows across your face, making the bells flash just enough to hold attention. No one fed you lines. You were simply expected to amuse, a shifting target depending on wine consumption, meat quality, and which noble had insulted whom during supper. You started safe, mimicking the chamberlain's nasal lectures about dusty candlesticks while ignoring his own crooked wig. A few snorts. Goblets clinked. Someone turned on his bench to watch. Encouraged, you pivoted to the bishop's latest sermon, that tepid affair that put even flies to sleep. Wobbling knees, flapping arms, you declared God loved noble-born souls best because they taste less like onions when they die. Laughter this time, not roaring, but present. You were still standing. That meant continue. You quickly learned, being a fool wasn't about jokes. It was about tension, knowing when to release it before ceilings cracked, when to poke just enough to deflate egos without bursting them. Every noble here nursed grievances too proud to voice, too petty to swallow. Your job was to voice them sideways, dressed in motley, smiling like you didn't understand your own words. That first night established the pattern. You expanded routines gradually, walking the silken spite tightrope where some nights the threads frayed beneath you. You learned to read rooms by scent and silence. Strong wine and plentiful meat meant easier laughs. Newly collected taxes meant tighter purses and looser tempers. If the lord's wife glared holes through his mistress, you avoided marriage jests. If border news arrived by grim-faced messengers, war stayed off limits. You implied rather than accused, resembled rather than revealed. Every syllable wrapped in winks and pratfalls. If they pretended not to catch the insult, you pretended you'd never thrown one. Early on, you called a noble's hunting dog the better air. The room froze mid-breath. You halted mid-gesture, hat slipping, but then the noble chuckled. Once, barely, and laughter resumed like floodwaters retreating. You bowed, leaving the joke unfinished. Everyone understood. No one said it aloud. They claimed jesters enjoyed special protection, that fools held license to speak truths others couldn't, that you were somehow sacred. But you'd seen a kitchen boy dismissed for laughing at the wrong moment, heard whispers about a jester hanged for mimicking the wrong lord's limp too accurately. Protection, you realized, was mostly myth, something people told themselves to make cruelty feel ceremonial. The bladder stick helped. Its wobbling squeak when you bonked your own head saved bad jokes. The wet fart sound against your hip always earned at least one tipsy smile. You used it to point, emphasize punchlines, underscore absurdity. Yet you noticed its shape. Lightweight, padded, but undeniably a club. You wondered if it was meant for defense or simply to remind you of your place. A fool with a stick looks ridiculous. A fool without one just looks afraid. Laughter became addictive. You chased it even when instinct said stop, stretching jokes too long, milking gags for extra beats, desperate for one more chuckle from wine-sodden nobles. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the following silence sat cold and wet, like stepping barefoot into a midnight pond. New material emerged through trial and error, rhymes, riddles, juggling when fruit came flying. You slipped into noble cadences debating which lands grew the finest turnips. They laughed. You laughed with them. Never first, but always present. Then came the steward incident. You mimicked his post-feast stomach clutching. He went pale, not embarrassed, murderous. His hand flew to his belt knife before he remembered the audience. Your mouth dried, but then someone laughed too loud, and danger passed. You bowed deeper this time, gratitude in posture. The haircut joke was unplanned. Mid-story about an ugly knight whose helmet kept fleeing, you noticed the young noble near the dais. Golden curls arranged with painterly precision, smug as a well-fed cat. Before thought caught up, the words tumbled out. Something about roosters, wig-makers, and mirrors cracking to avoid reflections. That heartbeat of silence stretched longer than any punchline. Then the young man snorted, ugly and unexpected, sloshing wine on his sleeve as he ruffled his own hair dramatically. He's not wrong. The room erupted. You grinned. You bowed. You pressed a hand to your chest. Only jesting, but the truth burned behind your teeth. The best jokes weren't fiction. They were truth-wearing bells. One night, a noblewoman laughed too richly at your wit. Her husband watched her the way butchers watch clever livestock. You saw her smile die, shoulders stiffening. Without missing a beat, you deployed the bladder stick fart noise, crude salvation that reset the room's temperature. Your third near-disaster that week. You began understanding. Court wasn't a place, but a performance. The throne merely a chair, the hall just stone. What made it lethal was everyone pretending it wasn't dangerous. Smiles became weapons. Silences became traps. You walked through satin and silver, but every step trod on something sharp: pride, jealousy, ambition. And you alone were expected to stomp on all of it while grinning through the blood. They summoned you more often now, not from affection. The summons came on a night when the castle felt particularly hollow, when the moon hung low and the candles had burned down to stubs, their wax pooling like frozen tears. You were roused from your straw mattress by the same steward who had handed you your motley weeks before. He stood in your alcove doorway, studying you with the detached curiosity of a man inspecting a questionable cut of meat. "The Lord wants a word," he said. Now, you didn't ask why. You dressed in silence, the bells on your sleeves muffled with cloth, yet still they jingled faintly, like a nervous heartbeat you couldn't control. The Lord's chambers were warmer than you expected, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and something medicinal. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even look up from his wine as he said, "Tell me that joke again. The one about the friar and the sheep." Slower this time. You obeyed, dissecting the joke like a surgeon removing a tumor, peeling back each layer, praying the autopsy killed the humor before it killed you. The Lord chuckled once. A dry, papery sound. Then he waved you away. You weren't sure if it was mercy or a warning. You returned to your alcove with your stomach knotted tight, the muffled bells beneath your blanket the only sound in the dark. By now, the motley no longer itched, not because it had softened, but because your skin had given up fighting it. Then the boy arrived. He tumbled into the great hall during a feast, announced like some exotic fruit. Hands springing him forward, legs kicking wildly, the bells on his feet singing with every movement. The nobles roared before he even spoke. His motley was brighter than yours had ever been. Freshly stitched, the colors still bold, the fabric holding its shape like it remembered the tailor's dummy. His voice carried like a town crier's, crisp and rehearsed. His jokes were polished arrows hitting every expected target. And his grin, God, his grin, was the grin of someone who didn't yet know what grins cost. You were introduced not by name. You didn't have one anymore, but by category. Our own jester. Someone announced with an exaggerated bow, as if presenting a half-trained hound. Broken in, mostly house-trained. The room laughed. You laughed too, because not laughing would have been dangerous. The boy, he couldn't have been more than 12, gave you a nod. It was meant kindly, which somehow made it worse. They let him perform that night. You were instructed to sit and watch, not in the shadows where you usually lurked, but near the fire where everyone could see you watching him. His act was good. You hated that it was good. He mimicked the steward's pompous stride perfectly, added a song about noble flatulence that even you wouldn't have dared, juggled 3 apples while reciting a filthy version of the Lord's Prayer. Each laugh from the nobles felt like a brick being laid around you. He's on loan from the northern court. A lady at the high table whispered too loudly. I hope he stays. He's just so fresh. The word landed in your gut like a stone. You felt old, worn, watched. After the performance, the ring-handed lord beckoned the boy over, handed him a gilded goblet of something that smelled expensive. Good work, he said. Then, as an afterthought, he called you over too. Our own fool's seen better days, haven't you? He asked. You nodded, the bells on your collar tinkling like loose coins. Perhaps you two can learn from each other. The joint performance was scheduled for the following night. They sat you side by side at the feast and ordered you to make each other laugh. You knew what this was. Not camaraderie. Sport. They wanted to see who was quicker, sharper, who bled more entertainingly. You tossed a line. He parried. He sang a rhyme. You countered with a limerick. It went well. Until it didn't. You mimicked his squeaky voice just a little too accurately, and the room howled. The boy flinched, just a flicker across his face, but recovered with a cartwheel, calling you grandfather fool as he landed. Someone threw a pear at your head. You ducked too late. They cheered like they'd witnessed high art. Later, when you were removing your bells by the kitchen hearth, the boy found you. He sat cross-legged on the soot-stained stones, his fresh motley already smudged with grease. They're not laughing at me the same way anymore, he said. You didn't answer. He looked smaller without the torchlight. Less sure. Do you ever get used to it? He asked. This time, you answered. No, you said. You just get quieter. The boy didn't last. One evening, he slipped during a backflip. Just a fraction, just enough, and his shoulder smashed into the hearthstone edge with a crack that silenced the hall. Then came the laughter, louder than any he'd ever earned intentionally. Again, someone shouted. Drunken duck, another noble jeered. They helped him up, his smile stretched too tight, eyes glazed with panic. He didn't cry until the curtains closed. By morning, he was gone. No farewells. No replacements. You returned to performing alone, but something had shifted. The nobles watched you differently now. Not warmer, just hungrier, like they were waiting to see how far you'd go to keep your place. They began demanding crueler work, mocking foreign guests, slandering servants to their faces, impersonating allies who'd fallen from favor. You danced through it as best you could, but the tightrope had narrowed to a thread. The applause grew sparse. The smiles turned sharp. One evening, you were ordered to entertain a visiting baron and his stone-faced wife. You delivered your usual routine, bumbling priests, rhyming gossip, a fart noise tucked into a prayer. The baron chuckled politely. His wife didn't move a muscle. Afterward, the Lord pulled you aside. They weren't impressed. His breath smelled of spiced wine and rotting teeth. Try harder next time. You nodded, though you had nothing left to try. That night, you sat on your cot with the motley folded across your lap, still warm from your skin. The bells were tangled. The collar bore a stain that no amount of scrubbing could lift. You didn't cry. You hadn't in years. But you sat there longer than usual, staring at the patchwork and wondering if it had ever been properly washed, or if every fool left something of himself in the seams. You'd thought they wanted laughter. You'd believed they needed distraction. Now you understood. They didn't laugh because it was funny. They laughed because you were trying so desperately to please them. They laughed at your failures, your flinches, your willingness to pretend not to notice when the punchline landed on you instead of its intended target. The truth settled over you like damp wool. They don't enjoy the fool. They enjoy the squirm. When the bishop arrived in his wheeled monstrosity, a carriage with a cross carved so deep into the door it looked less like decoration and more like a warning, the entire court straightened. His robes were the red of fresh meat. His rings caught the light like signal fires. He carried himself like a man who'd forgotten how to doubt. You were summoned after the feast, after the prayers, after a sermon so long it curdled the wine in your stomach. The Lord gestured you forward with a wave that wasn't quite permission. The bishop didn't look at you at first, just murmured something to his companion that might have been a warning or a wager. "Make him laugh," the Lord commanded. Religious men were always the hardest. Not because they lacked humor, but because when they did laugh, it was with one hand resting on the knife at their belt. You started safe. A rhyme about fish on Fridays, a pun about relics that smelled suspiciously like mutton, an impression of a village priest whose sermons wandered off and returned drunk. The bishop didn't smile. The Lord did. That was enough to keep breathing. So you pressed on carefully, testing the ice with each step. A joke about saints who kept losing their heads. A jibe about monks selling salvation by the bottle. A bit about a confessor so pious he never stopped talking long enough to listen. Somewhere in the third tale, the bishop's mouth twitched. Just once. Just enough. The next morning, the steward complimented your restraint, as if every word you hadn't said was part of the act, as if silence was just another performance. You nodded gratefully, but filed the word away. You weren't being praised for wit. You were being rewarded for walking a line they refused to mark for you. You began noticing the pattern. When tensions rose, when border news turned grim, when a noble died suspiciously young, when the crops failed without sufficient rain to blame, you were trotted out to joke about God. Not directly, never directly, but through proxies and parallels. Mock the bishop's cousin. Mimic the tone-deaf choir boy. Invent a friar who mistakes sheep for sinners and baptizes an entire flock in a well. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they didn't. But the permission was always temporary. Say the wrong thing or the right thing at the wrong moment, and suddenly it wasn't satire. It was blasphemy, and you wouldn't know which until someone else decided. During Lent, the rules changed. No jokes about indulgences or virgin saints with suspiciously round bellies. You were told to be edifying. So you wrote a short play, a jester visited by 3 holy men trying to save his soul. In the end, he repents, but only after they agree to lighten their purses. You thought it clever. The Lord chuckled. The bishop called it concerning. You weren't punished. Not exactly. But the next day, your stew bowl was half empty, and the cook suddenly couldn't meet your eyes. Then came the plague. It didn't arrive with fanfare. Just empty seats at supper. A sealed wing. A priest swinging incense through the halls faster than usual. You were told not to mention it. So of course you did. Your first joke was quiet. Something about rats and hats and titled fleas. It earned a stifled laugh from a page. The second was louder, about a noble who bathed in wine because water offended him. That one earned silence. You retreated into mimicry for days. No one complained, but no one laughed either. It's hard to laugh when the coughing starts. Then, one night after too much fear-laced wine, the Lord commanded, something light. Lift us. You tried. Jokes about bedpans. About snoring chambermaids. About the steward's fear of spiders. It wasn't enough. They wanted you to laugh for them. So you did. You slapped your own face. You faked a seizure. You joked that if you died of plague, at least you'd die clean. Finally scrubbed down by holy water and fire. They laughed too hard at that. And just like that, you were useful again. But the risks grew. You learned some jokes weren't yours to write. One morning, a folded parchment appeared on your cot. No name, no mark, just 3 lines of rhyme and a crude drawing of a monk chasing a chicken. You performed it that night not because it was funny, but because you recognized the Lord's brother's handwriting. The joke landed. The bishop did not laugh. Your shoes went missing the next day. Another time, you were handed a full script. 5 minutes of razor-sharp satire about a cardinal and his suspicious number of nephews. It was brilliant. It was dangerous. It wasn't yours. Perform this before the bishop's next visit, the steward ordered. You did. The room erupted. The bishop left without finishing his wine. You woke with a bruise on your ribs and no memory of how it got there. You were beginning to understand. Even when they fed you the lines, you were still the one bleeding for them. The breaking point came after a Lenten feast when the bishop returned for some minor ceremony no one bothered to explain to you. You'd been warned. No saints. No relics. No popes in nightshirts. You nodded, planning to stick to laundry jokes and lazy squires. Then the shout came from the back of the hall, a noble's wine-thickened voice. Tell the one about St. Hubert and the goats. You froze. The joke wasn't yours. You'd only heard it once, whispered by a drunken squire who swore the bishop would find it hilarious. The room waited. You told it. You watered it down. You softened the ending. The bishop did not laugh. You were dismissed early. No applause, no eye contact, just that terrible moment when the entire court seemed to hold its breath. You bowed backward out of the hall, your bells suddenly deafening in the silence. You made it to your alcove before the pain came. You never saw who hit you, never heard the first blow. When you woke, hours or days later, your jaw refused to close properly, and something hard rattled loose in your mouth when you moved your tongue. You spat it into your palm. A tooth, one of the front ones, small and white and useless. No one visited during your recovery. Someone left stale bread by your feet each morning like feeding a half-forgotten dog. You spent those blurred days counting cracks in the ceiling, wondering which part of the joke had crossed the line. Not the words, but the moment, that invisible shift when amusement becomes indictment. When you could finally stand without vomiting, a servant kicked your cot at dawn. You're to pack, she said. Bring the bells. The castle was evacuating, not in panic, but with the grim efficiency of people who'd done this before. Carts groaned under hastily packed valuables. Horses stamped impatiently as servants secured saddlebags. Nobles stood in doorways barking orders no one followed. A few glanced at you as you passed, their expressions unreadable. The plague had returned. Or maybe it had never left. The city reeked of sour smoke, its streets dotted with blackened piles where bodies had been burned. The castle windows had been shuttered for weeks, not against cold, but against the sound of coughing. It hadn't worked. You were loaded onto a wagon with the cook's boy, 2 barrels of salted fish, and a cage of clucking hens. The bells on your costume jingled with every rut in the road until the driver threatened to cut them off with a butcher's knife. You believed him. The new manor was smaller, perched on a hill where the wind howled like a starving thing. The great hall smelled of mouse droppings and stale incense. You were given a space near the hearth, though the fire was only lit when someone important felt a chill. They made you perform the first night as if nothing had changed. You told a joke about masked rats. A few strained chuckles. Someone coughed. Someone else left. You pretended not to notice. That became the new rule. Pretend not to notice. There were fewer people now, fewer servants, fewer nobles, fewer laughs, but still enough to demand entertainment. You were expected to fill silences where voices used to be, to cheer dining halls where half the guests hadn't arrived, where the ones who did only picked at their food. You danced. You fell down. You recycled the same 3 jokes in different orders, hoping the wine had dulled their memories enough to laugh again. It usually had. War came not with trumpets, but with tax collectors. The Lord began selling furniture, then livestock, then allegiances. New banners appeared in the hall. New guests with names you weren't meant to remember. Some spoke your language. Some didn't. You performed anyway. When they laughed, you breathed. When they didn't, you watched the Lord, praying he was too tired to take offense. You entertained men who smelled of blood and saddle leather, their armor still dented from recent battles. They clapped you on the back hard enough to bruise. One gripped your shoulder and said, "Mimic the enemy commander, or we'll find a fool who can." You gave the man a squeaky voice, a hunchback, and an unnatural love for his horse. They roared so loud you couldn't hear your own heartbeat. You attended funerals now, not as mourners, but as punctuation to grief. They buried knights with mud still on their boots, their prayers rushed and crooked. You stood by gravesides in full motley, juggling apples gone soft in the middle while priests mumbled half-remembered verses. You weren't part of the rite. You were the distraction, the thing that kept the living from noticing how easily the dead vanished. One morning, you were roused at dawn to perform for mercenaries riding out. You pulled on your damp costume and slipped twice in the mud before reaching them. One threw you a coin before you spoke. You rhymed your thanks. Another threw a bone. It hit your knee. You rhymed that too. They laughed. You didn't stop until they were gone. You lost another tooth 2 weeks later, not to fist this time. It simply tumbled into your hand while you drank from a chipped cup. You stared at it a long while before tucking it into a crack in the wall behind your sleeping mat. It felt like something that should stay hidden, like rot that spreads faster when seen. You began recognizing the look nobles got when deciding whether to laugh. Not joy, but calculation. Their world was shrinking. Their allies were dying. Their fortunes unraveled like poorly spun thread. Your jokes didn't make them happy. They made them feel clever for understanding the joke. That was enough. Most nights, you developed new material, shorter, sharper, safer. No more jabs at noble marriages or fat bishops. Now it was bodily humor, barnyard comparisons, carefully curated nonsense. You did a bit about tripping over your own bells and blaming cursed ancestors. They liked that. You did it 3 nights straight. On the 4th, no one laughed. Someone threw a chicken leg. You caught it midair. They laughed at that. Sleep became scarce. The coughing returned to the walls. Someone in the kitchen died, and you were given their blanket, still warm when you wrapped it around your shoulders. You didn't ask who it had belonged to. You weren't sure knowing would make it better. One afternoon, you found yourself rehearsing alone in the ravaged garden, testing a new voice for an imaginary friar, high and nasal, with an exaggerated limp. No one had asked. No one was watching. You just needed to know if it worked. When you finished the bit, you realized you'd started laughing. Not a real laugh, just a breath, a wheeze, something that might have been laughter in another life. It scared you more than silence ever had. The mirror became your secret audience. Not glass, just warped bronze hanging near the guest chambers, its edges rippling like it couldn't decide whether to melt or remember. At night, when the corridors emptied, you'd sit cross-legged before it, watching your reflection not as a person but as some tired portrait that had grown weary of being stared at. The motley looked even worse in the distorted metal, garish yet lifeless, like someone had dressed up a corpse for festival day. Your face was all wrong angles and shadows, one eye drooping lower than you remembered. The gap where your tooth had been now a dark comma in your grimace. You'd stopped trying to smile at reflections. It felt too much like lying. One particularly quiet night, when the castle's silence pressed like a pillow against your ears, you looked into that bronze smear and said aloud, "You're not funny." The reflection nodded. It shouldn't have, but it did, just the slightest dip of its chin, like someone humoring a child who'd finally stumbled upon truth. You didn't blink, didn't breathe, just kept staring. Strangely, you weren't frightened. If anything, it was the most seen you'd felt in months. You tilted your head left. So did it. You frowned. It grinned. "They'll forget me the second I tumbled down the stairs," you whispered. The grin widened. You half expected applause. So began your nightly conversations, not proper dialogues, just observations tossed at the metal like breadcrumbs to pigeons. "They named the hound, but not me," you'd remark. "Isn't that something?" The mirror's laughter sounded exactly like yours, soft and sad and barely there at all. It became ritual, performed for nobles by day, for the mirror by night. You had no name here, no rank, no rights. But at least you had one witness who never demanded more than you'd already given. Unlike the nobles, this audience never asked you to bleed. Some nights you'd reach out, fingertips brushing cold bronze, just to see if it felt warm. It never did. But sometimes, maybe it was the candlelight, maybe your tired eyes, you'd swear something pressed back. Meanwhile, the applause in the great hall grew thinner. Some evenings you weren't certain you'd heard any at all. The nobles had turned quieter these days, not somber, just bored in some new, deeper way. The deaths had changed something fundamental. Feasts felt smaller. Fires burned lower. Jokes had to shout louder to be heard over the yawning void of collective indifference. And you'd been here so long the rushes remembered your limp before you did. It happened during an old routine, the one where you leapt over a wine cask into a somersault, performed 100 times without fail. This time your foot caught on someone's abandoned goblet. The landing never came, just a wet crunch as your ankle folded like greenwood. The hall held its breath, then erupted, not in concern, in laughter, the kind that leaves bruises. You tried standing. Your leg refused. Was that part of the act? Someone shouted. Do it again, a page's voice chirped. You grinned automatically, that old twitch wired deep into your face now. Someone rewarded you with a bread roll that landed trampled in the rushes. When you finally hobbled off, no one followed. No one helped. They just returned to their meat and wine and murmured, "He's getting old." That's the cruel joke about fools. You don't get to age. You only get to slow down. And that isn't the same thing at all. The bells on your ankles used to sing when you danced. Now they dragged. You heard them when you weren't moving. When you lay awake trying to find a position that didn't make your spine scream. The tumbles that once looked effortless now ended with grunts. Your comebacks arrived a breath too late. And that breath's delay cost you everything. Then came the new fool. Younger. Louder. The last one had burned bright and vanished as they all did. This one had just enough edge to amuse and just enough fear to stay in line. His bruises healed overnight. The nobles adored him. Not like they'd loved you, if they ever had, but like people love a new goblet before the first wine stain sets in. When the Lord gestured toward the dais, the boy bounded up. When they said fool, they meant him. When they mentioned you, if they remembered at all, it was with that tone reserved for things that should have been replaced seasons ago. You told yourself it was temporary. Courts change like weather. But deep down, you knew the truth. You weren't the jester anymore. You were the reminder that jesters wear out. Some days they forgot to summon you entirely. Other times they'd remember halfway through supper and call you forward with a wrist flick, as if you'd failed by not anticipating their boredom. You still performed when commanded, but your jokes landed softer now. Your voice frayed where it once soared. You saw the wince before the laugh. The exchanged glances that said, plain as parchment, he's slipping. You felt it too, so you prepared something special, one last brilliant routine. Biting satire wrapped in flawless mimicry, the steward's pompous cadence, the lady's gossip loops, the knight who couldn't tell pigs from peasants. Risky, yes, but elegant. You rehearsed until your throat bled and your bad leg trembled from holding the poses. You timed it perfectly, delivered every line with precision. It didn't land. Just silence. Not the good kind, not the breath held before punchline kind, but the empty kind that sounds like a door clicking shut. A few blinked. Someone coughed. A noblewoman frowned, not offended but confused. Across the hall, the new fool tilted his head like he was trying to decide if you were performing or having a fit. Then someone chuckled awkwardly. The moment passed. You bowed anyway. You had to. Not bowing might have been worse. You smiled because not smiling might have been fatal. And as you turned to limp back to your corner, a silver goblet whistled through the air and cracked against your cheekbone. You heard the impact before feeling it. Then came the warmth. Not pain yet, just heat and ringing ears. Your hand came away slick with red from nose or mouth. You couldn't tell. Laughter, of course. The thrower, some minor lord with more wine than wit, was applauded. Bullseye, someone yelled. Another offered to fetch a second cup for a better shot. The new fool hesitated. For one heartbeat. He looked at you like he might help, might say something. Then he smiled instead and stepped into the space you'd left behind. You wiped your face on your sleeve. You bowed again. You didn't remember standing. Then retreated to the shadows where the blood wouldn't show as clearly. The summons came on a night when the torches spat more smoke than light. You were dozing in your alcove. If the twitching half-sleep you'd learned to call rest could be called that, when the steward's shadow fell across your face. Lord's orders, he said, nudging your ribs with a boot toe. The Venetian envoy's here. You knew what that meant. The last envoy had demanded you impersonate his rival's stammer until wine came out his nose. The hall stank of burnt peacock and the peculiar sweetness of overripe pears. The Venetian sat at the high table, his velvet sleeves too wide for local fashion, fingers glittering with glass rings that caught the light when he gestured. You took your place by the fire pit, your bad ankle throbbing in time with the hearth's crackle. They wanted the classics first, the drunken priest, the flatulent knight, the steward's obsession with ledger lines. You delivered them all with mechanical precision, watching the Venetian's face for clues. He chuckled at the right moments, but his eyes kept darting to the Lord's youngest daughter. Then the Lord leaned forward, his rings clicking against the table. Do the one about the Pope's mule. A hush fell. The Venetian's eyebrows climbed his forehead. You knew this game. The joke wasn't about the mule. It was about testing boundaries, about seeing how far the foreigner would let you go. You took a breath and launched into the bit, careful to keep your voice light, your gestures broad. Halfway through, you saw the Venetian's shoulders relax. Too soon, a noble from the far end shouted, "Do it properly." With the accent. The room stilled. The Venetian's smile didn't slip, but his fingers tightened around his cup. You hesitated, just a heartbeat, then dropped into the exaggerated Venetian lisp, the one that turned every S into a wet whistle. The Lord's table erupted. The Venetian's knuckles went white. And then, whether from the pain in your ankle or the look in the envoy's eyes or some long-buried scrap of pride, you slipped in an extra line, one you'd never dared before. And thus spoke the mule to his holiness. At least I only kick with my hind legs. Silence. Then the Venetian laughed, a real, startled bark of amusement, and raised his glass to you. The Lord's face darkened for half a breath before he joined in, but you saw the calculation in his eyes. You'd pleased the wrong man. The rest of the night blurred. You remember the Venetian pressing a coin into your palm as he left. Glass, not gold, but warm from his hand. Remember the Lord's grip on your shoulder afterward, his breath hot and vinegary in your ear. Cleverness is a knife, fool. Best remember which throat it's meant for. You bowed so low your bells brushed the rushes. That was the last time they called you for an envoy's feast. Winter came early that year. The new fool, barely 16 but already nimble as a cat, took over the more visible duties. You were kept for smaller audiences now. Local lords, minor officials, the occasional wealthy merchant who'd paid for the full court experience. One such night, performing for a wool merchant's bored sons, you noticed the Lord's brother watching from the shadows. Not laughing, not even smiling, just observing, his fingers steepled under his chin. When you finished, he beckoned you over with one finger. "They say jesters remember everything," he murmured. "Is it true?" You gave him your best, empty-headed grin. "Remember what, my lord?" He studied you a long moment before tossing a silver penny at your feet. "Exactly. The cough that had been working its way through the servants' quarters found you soon after. At first it was just a tickle, something to clear your throat between jests. Then came the nights when you woke gasping, your chest heaving like a bellows with holes. The new fool started covering your shifts. No one commented. You took to wandering the castle at odd hours, when the halls were empty enough to let you pass without notice. One such night, you found yourself in the scriptorium, a place you'd never been summoned to perform. The scribe was gone, but a single candle still burned, its light catching on the edge of an unfinished letter. You couldn't read the words, but you recognized the seal, the Venetian's mark. Behind you, a floorboard creaked. Looking for material? The Lord's brother stood in the doorway, a quill tucked behind his ear like a feather from some strange bird. You bowed, the motion sending you into a coughing fit. When you straightened, he was holding out a cup of something dark and pungent. "For the cough," he said. Then, softer, "Drink it all." You did. It tasted of honey and grave dirt. 3 nights later, when the coughing stopped for good, no one remarked on it. The new fool got your alcove. Your motley was boiled clean and given to a traveling player who lasted less than a season. Only the mirror in the guest corridor might have remembered your face, if mirrors could remember, and if anyone had thought to look. The castle forgot you faster than winter forgets snow. Within 3 moons, your name became that old jester. Then just a vague gesture toward the hearth where you used to sleep. The new fool learned quickly, his bones still supple, his teeth intact, his coughs merely theatrical. He never asked about the dark stain on the flagstones where your medicine had spilled. They repurposed your bells first. The cook's daughter strung them around her goat's neck, laughing when the creature shook its head and made music. Your bladder stick became a toy for noble children. They'd chase each other through the courtyard, shrieking as they swung it at shins and shoulders. The motley they burned, though not before cutting off the least faded patches to mend the new fool's costume. Only the mirror remembered. On certain nights when the castle slept, its warped surface would shiver as if troubled by some half-formed reflection. The scullery maid swore they heard faint jingling near it, though no one ever passed. The Lord's brother took your death, if that's what it was, as opportunity. At the next feast, he raised a toast to absent fools, his smile sharp as he watched the Venetian envoy's face. The joke landed exactly as intended. Meanwhile, your story began its slow distortion. The steward, when pressed, would recount your best japes, though now the punchlines came at your expense, casting you as the butt rather than the teller. The kitchen boy who'd once brought you scraps now entertained the staff with exaggerated impressions of your limp. Even the new fool, when particularly drunk, would mimic your coughing fits for laughs. By the time the minstrels came, you'd already become legend. They sang of a jester so devoted he'd choked on his own wit, though whether on food or words or poison depended on the singer's taste for tragedy. The Lord never corrected them. Your grave, if one existed, went unmarked. The castle dogs had a particular spot they liked to dig near the midden heap, but whether they ever unearthed anything more than bones from supper was a question no one thought to ask. The new regime required new stories. When plague returned, the current fool made sport of doctors who prescribed leeches for broken bones, a joke you'd never have dared, though it earned him extra bread for a week. Wars came and went, each requiring fresh mockery of fresh enemies. The old tensions, between lords and bishops, between merchants and nobles, remained, but found new expressions. You became a seasonal ghost. On All Hallows' Eve, the servants would whisper about hearing bells near the old scriptorium. Midwinter feasts occasionally featured some graybeard reminiscing about the clever one who did that bit with the cardinal's hat, though fewer each year remembered which bit that was. The mirror state. When the castle changed hands during some border dispute, the new lord's wife declared it ugly and ordered it taken down. But the servants, superstitious or sentimental, forgot, until she turned her attention elsewhere. It hung there still when the roof beams finally gave way 2 generations later, its surface cracking into a spiderweb of distorted reflections. Your best jokes survived you, though no one recalled their author. They became proverbs, then nursery rhymes, then fragments even the grandmothers couldn't quite place. The Lord's great-grandson once repeated one at a banquet, earning polite chuckles from men who didn't understand why their fathers stiffened. The castle itself forgot. Stones were repurposed for pigsties. The great hall became a granary, then a tannery, then just a place for farmers to escape the rain. The hearth where you'd slept grew cold for good when the last chimney collapsed. Only the land remembered in its way. Where the midden had been, a particular patch of nettles always grew tallest, their stinging leaves perfect for the dye vats, the weavers said. And on certain misty mornings, when the light fell just so through the ruins, children playing there would sometimes startle at what looked like motley-colored rags fluttering from the brambles, though when they looked closer, there was never anything there. Centuries later, a child's finger smudges the glass case in a provincial museum. "What's that?" she asks, pointing at the pigskin bladder mounted on a stick. The tired guide barely glances up. "A jester's toy, sweetheart. From the Middle Ages." She presses closer, breath fogging the glass. The artifact looks smaller than she imagined, just a shriveled sack tied to worm-eaten wood, its surface cracked like an old man's knuckles. No bells, no bright colors, nothing to suggest it ever made anyone laugh. Did they really hit people with it? The guide chuckles. Oh, it was all in good fun. He moves on to show her the suits of armor. The child lingers. There's something about the way the leather has dried into a permanent grimace that makes her shiver. When no one's looking, she touches 2 fingers to the glass in quiet apology. Elsewhere in the world, a university student stumbles through his thesis on medieval court culture. He writes 3 pages about the licensed truth-teller myth before deleting them all. The finished paper mentions jesters only as footnotes to the real history of kings. In a tourist trap tavern, a barman mixes a fool's folly cocktail, peach schnapps and cheap champagne, served in a plastic cup with jingle bells tied to the stem. The drink special poster features a grinning, cross-eyed face that looks nothing like you. At a Renaissance fair, a sweating accountant straps on motley for the first time. The polyester itches. The bells sewn to his elbows keep catching in his nacho cheese. He complains to his wife that the authentic Jester's staff he bought online broke after 2 pratfalls. No one remembers how the bladder stick really sounded when it connected with flesh. That particular wet thwack has been lost to time. The child leaves the museum disappointed. In the gift shop, she eyes a jester hat with 3 floppy horns, each tipped with a silver bell. Her mother says no. That night, she dreams of running through castle corridors, her own laughter echoing back strangely. She wakes with the taste of old wine and something metallic in her mouth. The digital clock reads 3:17 a.m. Outside her window, an alley cat knocks over a bottle, the clinking sound almost like. But no, morning comes. School buses grind their gears. The museum opens its doors to another crowd. The bladder stick sits untouched in its case, collecting dust in the weak winter light. Somewhere a historian sighs over conflicting accounts of court fools. A novelist scribbles a scene where a jester delivers wise counsel to a king, then backspaces through the cliché. An actor practices his medieval fool voice for an audiobook. All squeaks and hiccups, nothing like your actual rasp. The truth is this: no living soul recalls the exact curve of your missing tooth. No one could replicate the particular way your ankle clicked when you turned too fast. The archive contains no record of how you smelled after weeks in the same motley, sweat and sour wool, and the vinegar they used to clean the piss stains from your mattress. Your best joke, the one that made the Duke snort wine through his nose, doesn't translate to modern languages. The punchline hinges on a word that no longer exists. Yet, when the wind blows through the ruins of that old castle, now a heritage site with inadequate railings, it sometimes catches in what's left of the scriptorium wall, producing a faint whistling that could almost be mistaken for laughter. When a particularly cruel meme circulates online, someone inevitably comments the court jester has entered the chat, with no understanding of what that actually meant. And on rare nights, when some overworked comedian bombs on stage, when the silence between jokes stretches too long, when the hecklers' voices rise like torches in the dark, there is a moment, just a moment, when the air in the club grows thick with something older than disappointment, when the mic feedback screeches like a poorly tuned lute, when the comedian's forced grin falters in a way that has nothing to do with the material. In that moment, across centuries, you are perfectly understood.